Buenos días al otro lado del charco y bienvenidos a este extraordinario evento con el gran historiador británico Niall Ferguson. I am delighted to welcome all of you on both sides of the Atlantic for this extraordinary event. We have a truly distinguished guest with us today, and I'm sure we are going to learn from him a great deal. He doesn't need a lot of introduction, but just to keep with the formalities, I will say a few words before handing it over to him. He's, of course, one of the greatest historians alive today. He's also the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's a Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He's a filmmaker, of course, a very well-read columnist. He's also a consultant. He has his own advisory firm, I understand, Greenmantle. But above everything else, he's a truly extraordinary historian, the author of numerous books many of you know very well. I have been reading him for a long time, and I always learn a great deal from him, and I personally admire his work very, very much. He's the author of several books, of course, The Ascent of Money, Civilization, The West and the Rest, a great biography of Kissinger, Kissinger 1923-1968, The Idealist, and I believe most recently, The Square and the Tower. So it is really a great honor, Neil, if I may call you, Neil, to have you with us. We will keep the usual format. We will hear from you for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then I will kick off a conversation with you. I will put a few questions to you, and then I will pick up questions from the audience and then put them to you. I hope we can cover most of them, but if we don't, I apologize in advance. So Neil, it's a great, great pleasure, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Alvaro, for the invitation to talk to this predominantly Spanish-speaking audience. I see that we have people not only from Madrid, but also from Buenos Aires. I am embarrassed not to be able to give my remarks in Spanish. I'm still in the foothills of the Spanish language, and it's one of my promises to myself that I will at least get to somewhere halfway up the hill in the next couple of years, because I and my wife and our two young sons spend much of our time in a bilingual society, that of Northern California, and it really is high time I got beyond the schoolboy Spanish that I used when I was traveling around Spain at the age of 17 in imitation of Laurie Lee before going up to Oxford. I'm going to say a few words in English about the pandemic from an historian's perspective. And I'm going to keep it brief because I'm far more interested in a discussion than in a monologue. And I'm rather fed up of my own Zoom monologues at this point, after what feels like half a year of talking about this subject. I say half a year because I first heard about the new and mysterious form of pneumonia in Wuhan, China, on January the 4th, when a medical friend of mine, the great British oncologist Justin Stebbing, mentioned it in an email. I happened to be on my way to Asia in early January. I went on a week-long trip to Hong Kong, Taipei, and Singapore. And I realized by the time I had finished that trip that we were very likely in the very first phase of a global pandemic would be hugely disruptive. I flew from Asia to Davos in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum and found to my amazement that almost nobody there was remotely aware of this approaching pandemic. Instead, they wanted to have their usual conversation about climate change and bow down to Greta Thunberg I recall a sense of mounting incredulity at the absence of the pandemic from the discussion, and then horror when I realized that at least 3 delegates were at the World Economic Forum from Wuhan. So I began to write at that time warnings about the approach of the pandemic in my weekly newspaper column, and to talk about it in a variety of different forums, including at Davos, where I was a kind of Cassandra-like figure telling people, you're mad to be worried about climate change, however important that issue is. There's a pandemic on its way and it's flying at a very high speed on multiple passenger jets from China. I began also at that time to compose notes, which I usually do in the form of a PowerPoint deck, because I like charts and PowerPoint makes it easy to copy and paste those. I called it Networked Pandemic because it seemed to me, having written The Square and the Tower, that the key to what was happening was not just the properties of the virus, which we were reasonably quickly able to understand, but much more importantly, the structure of the social networks that it was about to spread through. In The Square and the Tower, I make the point a number of times that to understand contagion, whether it's biological or digital, you have to understand simultaneously the virus, the meme in the case of an online contagion, and the social network structure it attacks. And the key point that was obvious immediately to me in January was that we had never, as a human race, created a network so perfectly designed to spread a new pathogen than the one that we had built over the last 20 years in the name of globalization. So this deck, which now exceeds 800 slides, is my running commentary, running analysis, running research on the pandemic in all its aspects. And it will ultimately give rise, I fear, to another book. Writing books is a kind of addictive habit of mine. And that book, I think I'll give the title, The Politics of Doom, because it's been a fantastic illumination of our extraordinarily ambivalent relationship to disaster. On paper, the United States and the country of my birth, the United Kingdom, were very well prepared for a pandemic. They had all kinds of reports, all kinds of statutory instruments, all kinds of bureaucrats whose job it was to prepare for a pandemic. And yet when one actually arrived in January of this year, both the United States and the United Kingdom made a terrific mess of handling it. And they were in good company. A number of other European countries, including Spain, also Italy and Belgium, did relatively very badly in coping with this new pathogen. And the best measure of that is the excess mortality that those countries experienced this year, particularly in the months of April and May. Not every country has had this experience. In fact, there are a number of countries that have had no excess mortality whatsoever. If one ranked countries by their success in coping with COVID-19, the disease caused by the new virus, you would put Taiwan near the top, South Korea near the top, Israel near the top. You'd also give high marks to Germany and Japan, much bigger countries. And so we have a puzzle as historians before us. Why was it that the countries that were supposed to be well prepared, the UK and the US, did so badly, and other countries did so well? That's one of the key questions I want to address in this new book. But I think there's a broader question, and that's why the book is not just about pandemics. That would be too obvious. It's a book about all kinds of disaster and how we have an ambivalent relationship to disaster. We're haunted as a species by the end of the world. It's central to the great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, that some apocalyptic end will come. We're intensely preoccupied in our secular times with the end of the world. That's really the whole point of Greta Thunberg, to predict the imminent end of days if we don't cease altogether carbon dioxide emissions. Millenarian fantasies are a curious feature of our human condition. They seem to exist even when we think that we've become wholly secular and abandoned religion. During the pandemic in the United States, when California, New York, and other states were locked down, one of the most popular movies watched on Netflix was Contagion, which you may remember was a rather horrific science fiction movie about a catastrophically lethal pandemic. I think there's something very odd about people sitting at home in a lockdown watching Contagion. What is that about exactly? What is it about a disaster that is so fascinating? And yet, despite our having seen Contagion prior to 2020, we completely failed to be prepared for a real pathogen, even one much less deadly than the one in that movie. So let me, in order to open up the discussion, offer one simple general reflection about the nature of our relationship to doom, our individual doom, which is inevitable, our doom as a species, which must ultimately come about, though we have no real idea when, and also our inability as a species to get right the orders of magnitude. It was Stalin, I think, who said, although he was quoting Kurt Tucholsky, that one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. I think that's our problem with disaster. We struggle really to come to terms with the scale of death on an annual basis. Enormous numbers of people die each year. And yet we regard the mortality caused by COVID-19 as a catastrophe. In relative terms, it's still a really quite small pandemic compared with the huge pandemics of the past, the Black Death, or even the 1918-19 influenza, which killed around 3% of the world's population. COVID-19 is not going to get anywhere close to killing that large a proportion of the population. In the league table of pandemics, it ranks number 34 at the moment. But it's important to see that disasters, whether they're pandemics, earthquakes, wars, or for that matter, financial crises, disasters have a curious quality of metamorphosis. And this is the last thing I want to say. Before they come, before they happen, they are grey rhinos, grey rhinoceroses. That is to say, we see them coming, trundling towards us across the Serengeti. But when they arrive, they mutate into black swans. Having seen the pandemic coming, having been warned multiple times, not just by Bill Gates, that a pandemic was coming, when it actually arrived, we said, who could possibly have predicted this? This is a completely surprising and unexpected shock. The black swan moment is when an event like a pandemic, as it occurs, strikes us as completely unimaginable and unexpected. But there's one final thing, one final mutation that happens. And it doesn't happen to every disaster, but it happens to some. And that is that the disaster mutates or can mutate into a dragon king. Now, the dragon king is a term from the realm of natural science, and it refers to an event so large in its scale that it lies outside even a power law distribution. The idea that I want to suggest to you is that some disasters are far greater in their impact than the sheer body count would imply. World War I killed around 10 million, mostly young men, in conventional warfare over 4 years. But the significance of World War I as a disaster is not the number of people that it killed. It's the consequences that flowed from the war, the Russian Revolution, and all the other upheavals that we associate with the period after 1917. What we don't know yet about COVID-19 is whether or not it's a dragon king. It was a grey rhino. It was eminently predictable. It was a black swan. When it came, we were completely taken by surprise. What we don't yet know is if it's a dragon king, one of those historical disasters that so transforms the world that it becomes a truly world historical event. And perhaps in this discussion, Alvaro, you and I and the other people on this call can debate if COVID-19 is one of those world historical events, or if a year or 2 years from now, we'll be looking back and saying, what was all the fuss about? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Neil. Lots and lots and lots of food for thought there. Let me just mention in passing that as soon as you started talking, we had more people joining us from various parts of the world, Brazil, Mexico, the US, etc. So we have a truly global audience, a very appropriate audience for the kinds of thoughts you have been throwing at us provocatively. So let me kick off the discussion by asking you the following. You mentioned a number of countries that did quite well. Among them were a few liberal democracies, but also more recent democracies, let's say. But the list of countries that failed miserably also includes liberal democracies and some of the leading liberal democracies of the world. We have seen what works and what works less well. We have seen that testing and contact tracing and social distancing tend to work. We have seen the lockdowns don't necessarily work better than the alternatives and yet have, of course, awful consequences. So the question is, what does this tell us about, if anything, about the nature of liberal democracy? It is true that Germany, among others, did quite well, but it's also true that the United States did not, that your own country of origin did not, France, Italy, and Spain did not. Does this tell us anything about the nature of liberal democracy in dealing with potential king dragons, as it were?
I think not. I think the truth is that there isn't really any correlation between political system type and performance in the face of a public health emergency. One could take a look, for example, at South America, where a number of people on this call come from. There are countries in that part of the world that have had a devastatingly bad experience. Excess mortality in Ecuador and Peru has been extremely high. The situation in Brazil is notable because it's one of the few major countries that makes the United States look good. In Argentina, a country that had already entered financial crisis before the pandemic, the lockdown is having a disastrous economic effect. And one can't help feeling that as soon as it ends, Argentina will just have the same pandemic that other neighboring countries, including Chile, have already had. So all the lockdown has really done is to postpone the inevitable spread of the virus. It's an extraordinary picture that presents itself. I think one of the false inferences that people have drawn is that somehow China, the world's most powerful authoritarian, indeed totalitarian state, showed how to do this. And this is widely repeated, not least by Chinese propaganda outlets. Let's just be clear that this disaster happened because of China's one-party system, which sought to cover up the crisis in December and then delayed taking action until January the 23rd, by which time it was much too late. So I think it's important to establish that this disaster originates in an undemocratic system, and it is not, I think, accidental that is the case. And also, China's response when it finally admitted to the crisis was extraordinarily brutal. The lockdown of Hubei province, which included welding the doors on apartment buildings to confine people to their homes, should never have become a role model for liberal democracies. The country that got it right was Taiwan. Unfortunately, Taiwan is essentially shunned by the World Health Organization under pressure from Beijing, and is treated as a second-class citizen by most international agencies because of its ambiguous status as de facto an independent country that the Chinese happen to claim as a province. Taiwan got it right. Taiwan disbelieved Beijing, assumed that something bad was happening, had learnt the lessons of SARS and indeed of MERS, that coronaviruses are extraordinarily dangerous and contagious. And it did the two things you really need to do to control this virus. Rapid and widespread testing to identify infected people, and contact tracing to track down the people that they've been in touch with. And that's really the key to success. Countries that did this have had minimal excess mortality, Iceland, for example, and countries that have failed to do it have ended up with much higher excess mortality, the UK and the US. The big question, and this is the last thing I'll say, that we need to address is, why did some liberal democracies have public health bureaucracies that failed so badly? That is the real question for the United States and the United Kingdom. I can't speak about Spain, but I imagine a similar issue arises. If the Germans could get this right, why couldn't we? And I think the answer to that, which the media give, is President Trump is a buffoon, or Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a buffoon. And that is the wrong answer. That is the wrong answer. They may or may not be buffoons. It's not relevant. In a pandemic, it is the public health bureaucracy that has to make the call. This is a pathogen, it's contagious and deadly, and we need to do the following things to contain it. And the public health bureaucracies in the US, at the Department of Health and Human Services, and in the UK, failed. That can't be blamed on the president. It's not the president's job to micromanage the pandemic preparedness bureaucracy, nor is it the prime minister's. So I think that's an extremely important point to emphasize, because the media coverage of this pandemic has been terribly bad. And apologies to journalists on this call. The quality of coverage has been lamentable. It's been shocking to me how badly this has been done by eminent publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, who, let's remember, at the end of January, long after it was obvious that there was a disaster unfolding, condemned President Trump for cutting off passenger traffic from China, accused him of racism, and ran endless pieces saying that this was no more serious than seasonal influenza. Now that's a failure that the Washington Post in particular has conveniently forgotten about, because in its most recent coverage, it pretends that it was Fox News that spread fake news about the virus. No, it was the liberal media at the end of January who completely ballsed this up. So there's another question, and that is why it was that the media did such a terrible job. Why was it in the United States that Tucker Carlson was one of the very few journalists who got it right at the beginning? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask, but they're not specific to liberal democracy, Alvaro. They're specific to some liberal democracies.
That's correct. You mentioned the public health system in some of these liberal democracies, and I would add, Neil, that centralization played a key part in this. I mean, let's remember the U.S. government had the monopoly of testing until the very end of February. While in other countries, including Germany, there was a much more decentralized decision-making process by which tests could be decentralized to the whole country. And that happened much, much earlier, of course. By the time the US allowed laboratories to begin testing people privately, and that is to say, away from the central bureaucracy, of course, the contagion was widespread. So this is really an interesting point that you're making. Let's talk about the other side of the equation. We're talking about the public bureaucracies that failed miserably. There's also the conduct, the behavior of ordinary people. And I think this is also a really interesting element in this. I read in one of your recent columns a wonderful and terrifying quote by Thucydides, which I had come across a long time ago and completely forgotten. And let me briefly read it, because I think it's really interesting. And this is, of course, 430 BC. So we're talking about, 2,500 years ago. The catastrophe was, he's talking about the Athenian plague. This is important to mention, of course. The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. This is a truly terrifying thought. Have you seen any of this today? Have you seen ordinary people in the most civilized parts of the world willing to throw away civilization, the values, the institutions of civilization, the norms of social conduct that comport with civilization because of fear, because of the kind of psychological impact that the pandemic had throughout these people? Have you seen any of that?
Yes, I think we have. The obvious and I think superficial answer to your question is that in many parts of the United States, particularly the South, there's an aversion to wearing masks. The issue of mask wearing has in fact become politicized, like everything in the United States. Democrats take COVID-19 seriously, Republicans do not. Democrats wear masks, Republicans, including President Trump, do not. And this is, of course, one reason why in at least a dozen and probably more than a dozen states, we've seen a second wave of infection in the last few weeks, something that I remember predicting a couple of months ago. But that's a superficial answer. A more profound answer is, it seems to me that in our time, as in the time of Thucydides, as in the time of the Black Death in the 1340s, the contagion has been associated with a kind of collective madness. And I'll give you a very simple illustration of this point. What could be more strange in the midst of a pandemic to suddenly, collectively decide that the most important and burning issue in the country was the use of lethal force by the police against African Americans? This is an important issue, no doubt, one that has justifiably been debated a good deal in recent years. But it's very strange when you come to think of it, that in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans, mostly young, but not only young, took to the streets of virtually every major city to protest against police violence, in defiance not only of reason, since in the midst of the pandemic, large gatherings, even outdoors, seem ill-advised, but also in defiance of evidence. There's actually no real evidence that the US police disproportionately use lethal violence against African Americans. Actually, there's quite conclusive evidence the other way that my good friend Roland Fryer published several years ago. So when one views with detachment, as I as an historian try to do, the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, a horrible event, of course, but when one views the protests dispassionately, they seem reminiscent of the great upheavals that were associated with the Black Death in many European cities. I was reminded of the flagellant orders of the Middle Ages when I saw film of a scene in North Carolina when police officers washed the feet of two Black pastors after a demonstration in support of Black Lives Matter, to an extent that progressive leftists don't acknowledge. They are in fact in the grip of a religious mania. It was called by Matt Iglesias the Great Awokening, as opposed to the Great Awakening, a brilliant phrase I wish that I had thought of. And the Great Awokening has created all kinds of scenes of madness. Statues of Confederate generals were being removed before 2020, and one could argue that is appropriate. I personally don't like statues to be removed. If you don't like statues, build new ones, is my view. But I could see the argument for removing the statues of Confederate generals. But in the madness of 2020, statues of Abraham Lincoln are being removed. In Washington, it's been demanded. In Boston, it's been conceded. Statues that were erected with funds donated by freed slaves to honor the president who issued the Emancipation Proclamation. If this is not madness, I really can't think of a better illustration of a kind of collective insanity that has swept the United States this year. My 8-year-old son is a profound thinker, And he observed that there were in fact two pandemics currently sweeping the country: COVID-19 and what he called Wokeded-19. And as he added, Wokeded-19 is more infectious, Daddy, because you can get it from the internet. This is my favorite insight of the year, and I intend to repeat it, publish it, but attribute it to him. I only hope it doesn't prevent him from getting into a major university 10 years from now, because it's not a very woke thing to say.
Maybe we should have him as our next guest here, Neil. It'll be
He's much more conservative than me.
So you have, talking about what you said in your remarks with regard to what kind of consequences long-term will flow from this. You have written and said that you thought globalization in many ways was in retreat even before the pandemic. So let me put it to you. Could we infer from this that the pandemic will accelerate a process that was already going on? And if that is so, where will that lead in terms of communications, trade, the flow of ideas, the flow of values? These are major consequences, and perhaps then the consequences will be as huge as they were for events like World War I.
Yes, at the moment, I'm inclined to think that COVID-19 is a Dragon King event, not because it's going to kill a colossal proportion of the world's population. It, as I said, is not one of history's big pandemics, but because of the economic, social, and political consequences. One of these is certainly to accelerate the retreat of globalization. Peak globalization was in 2007. Since the financial crisis, there has been a retreat in every domain. The scale of trade in relation to economic output, migration, capital flows especially, even information flows as the internet becomes increasingly balkanized and regulated by governments. And I think COVID-19 has really accelerated that retreat of globalization. It will be very difficult for us, even if we want to return to the levels of hypermobility that characterized the last decade, when flights from Wuhan, not even a well-known Chinese city, went directly on a very regular basis to London, to Paris, to Rome, to Moscow, to New York, to San Francisco. Those were the flights that initially spread the new SARS-CoV-2 virus. When one looks at the scale, the volume of passenger traffic in the air today, it's vastly reduced. And I don't think it will return to the levels that we saw, not least because a significant proportion of us, including me, have realized that our constant flying from place to place and conference to conference was itself a kind of madness. I certainly find that my ideas are the same when I present them over Zoom as if I present them live on stage in Madrid. In fact, they're slightly better because I'm less jet lagged and marginally more coherent. I don't think we'll revert, I hope we won't revert, to the old habits of constant long-haul flights. I think there's also going to be, and this is a separate point, a serious geopolitical consequence to the pandemic. I already believed a year ago, actually more than a year ago, that Cold War II had begun between the United States and the People's Republic of China. I think the pandemic has revealed that was true, and it dispelled the doubts of many people who last year insisted that Cold War II was avoidable. I think that Cold War II is only going to intensify in the coming months. The spat over Hong Kong is just one of a number of issues that are going to cause not just friction between the United States and China, but a meaningful escalation in the direction of hostilities. Taiwan is the one I worry about the most because Taiwan is so much more strategically contentious than Hong Kong. And so I think the second thing to look for here is not just the retreat of globalization, but the escalation of Cold War II, and even the risk of a hot war, of World War III, if you like. I think that's something that most people are underestimating at the moment, because they're so distracted by Black Lives Matter or the second wave of COVID-19 that they've missed this really serious deterioration of the geopolitical situation. Border conflicts between China and India would have been front page news in any other year. The partition of Libya by Russia and Turkey would, I think, have made the front page in any other year. And when one looks at the language that's currently being used on the Chinese side by the Chinese Foreign Ministry and other Chinese representatives, it is unmistakably the language of Cold War. By contrast, in fact, Secretary of State Pompeo is quite mild in his language. So I think this is a really big deal. If one's asking what makes COVID-19 a dragon king, my answer would be if it actually contributes to Cold War II or even World War III, then it will certainly be a dragon king.
We have several participants asking about the growth of government. It's very fascinating to see around the world, actually, not just in a few countries, this increasing demand for more government at a time when government has failed miserably. And not just the public health authorities throughout the world. I'm talking about political decisions that were made by presidents and prime ministers, and the whole bureaucracies that in many ways made things worse. And yet there is this increasing demand for more government, as if in a way what has happened had actually exposed the failure of free markets and the failure of liberty. It is a really fascinating paradox, but it's one that's really out there. How do you address that?
Well, I tried to argue in a recent piece that the completely wrong conclusion to draw from the experience of the last 6 months was that we need more government. Actually, what's really striking is the size of the Department of Health and Human Services, the number of people who work for the Centers for Disease Control, which was the institution responsible for screwing up the testing that you mentioned earlier, Alvaro. It's not for lack of bureaucrats or lack of dollars that the United States has failed to manage this pandemic. It's because the administrative state, or deep state if you like, is so dysfunctional that it can't even do what it says on the tin. Pandemic preparedness was the job of Assistant Secretary Robert Kadlec. Where has he been? He's effectively been missing in action, hardly mentioned in the media. So I think that the first thing to establish is that the pathologies of the administrative state were laid bare by this crisis, despite the fact that CDC and its parent institution are much larger than they were in 1957, when under Dwight Eisenhower, the United States managed a pandemic of comparable dangerousness, the 1957 Asian flu, far more effectively. And actually, I wrote a paper on this subject recently, mentioned it in my most recent Bloomberg column. The 1957-58 Asian flu episode is like a mirror image of 2020. The Eisenhower administration didn't lock down any part of the economy. There were no school closures at the state or municipal level. The only thing the Eisenhower administration did was to help accelerate the very rapid process of finding a vaccine against the new influenza strain. And the cost of that to the federal government, $2.5 million with an M, dollars, a tiny, tiny proportion of 1957 gross domestic product. There's no discernible impact of the pandemic on the US economy in 57, 58. And so you turn to 2020, comparably dangerous pathogen, actually in some ways less dangerous, because this pathogen discriminates against the elderly, which the 57 flu did not. And we end up shutting down a large proportion of the economy, throwing people out of work for at least a month or 2 months, causing the federal debt to explode in size, and of course the dollar to be printed in extraordinary quantities by the Federal Reserve to finance all this. Now, this is going to be very difficult indeed to unwind, not least because Democrats are going to take it as evidence that the sky's the limit for government spending, that there really is no upper bound to the federal debt, and that there's no inflationary danger to financing it through the central bank. Unfortunately, conservatives had already in some measure compromised themselves on fiscal and monetary policy in the last 4 years. There's not much, if anything, left of the Tea Party spirit. And the word austerity has become a dirty word in the English-speaking world. So if the Democrats win, and I want to emphasize that that is not guaranteed, but if they win the White House and the Senate on November 3rd, then I don't see what will stop them using these instruments of policy to pursue a so-called progressive agenda. And I think that will almost certainly end badly. It'll slow growth, I'm fairly sure, and it will ultimately generate inflation. And I think we could end up in a world of stagflation much sooner than most economists imagine. I wish there were really good and effective counter-arguments to be deployed at this point. The most that I can say when I'm confronted by proponents of modern monetary theory is history will find you out. History will show that there is in fact an upper bound to public debt, that there is in fact nasty fiscal arithmetic, even if you are issuing the international reserve currency, that you can't expand the money supply indefinitely without inflationary downside risk. I'm saying all this, and I'm scorned for doing so, because the mood of confidence amongst so-called progressive economists is now unassailable. In effect, universal basic income has been adopted as mainstream. So has modern monetary theory in the atmosphere of crisis that struck in March. I think we'll look back and say that this was all gravely overdone. It's important to say, Alvaro, that I'm Niall Ferguson with an N-I-A-L-L spelling, not Niall Ferguson with an N-E-I-L spelling, the epidemiologist at Imperial College London, whose March 16th paper was the basis for the drastic changes of policy in the UK and the US that led to lockdowns, that led to a collapse of economic activity, that then necessitated massive fiscal and monetary expansion. This was all a disastrous series of mistakes, but it will be very hard, as I said, to undo those mistakes next year.
Yeah, before you came on, actually, we were talking about that, and I was wondering whether people were throwing stones at you in the streets, mistaking you for the other Ferguson.
Well, fortunately not, but metaphorically, on social media, the stones were flying, and I more or less had to issue a weekly clarification for the people with spelling difficulties that I'm in fact the Stanford-based historian and not the London-based epidemiologist. It's one of those occasions when you rather wish that your parents had chosen a different name, though I'm just grateful that they went for the Gallic spelling, because if we had the same spelling, I probably would be dead by now.
It would have been horrific. Several of our Argentinian participants, of course, are reminding us that money printing is at this point going crazy in Argentina. You mentioned the explosion of the balance sheets, of course, of the central banks of the world. Well, the Argentines have doubled the monetary base in a matter of just a few months. But of course, this is a phenomenon that's really widespread. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, as you know, I mean, has ballooned in unprecedented ways. So it is hard to think this will not eventually, at some point when the economic activity picks up again, lead to some form of very, very, very high in inflation. You mentioned the US elections. Many of our participants want you to bring out your crystal ball and tell us who's going to win. Let me put it in a different way, but it's going to be essentially the same question. I guess simplicity is, well, Trump is a buffoon. Most people in the US have now decided that he's a buffoon, that he's an embarrassment to America around the world. He has miserably mishandled the pandemic. People will get rid of him. Another way to look at it is, despite the millions of people who hate his guts, people remember that the economy was doing very well before the pandemic. People believe that it's better to have somebody who can, defy China when China needs to be defied, particularly if, as you mentioned, we're entering a new kind of Cold War. And then maybe some people, or the message will resonate with some people, that he's the law and order president. In many ways echoing the 1968 campaign by Nixon, who was not president at the time, of course. So which way do you look at this?
Well, I think the conventional wisdom in the media right now is that Trump is done. And indeed, some people are talking about landslides on November the 3rd. If you look at the polling, it's pretty bad from a Republican vantage point. I don't just mean at the national level where Biden leads by something like 9 percentage points. More seriously, at the level of the key swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Trump is underwater with voters in those states by quite a considerable margin. And so one hears almost on a daily basis predictions of impending disaster for the Republicans. I'm very skeptical about this analysis, partly because I heard exactly the same arguments made 4 years ago at exactly the same time by exactly the same people using exactly the same metrics. In fact, I had to point out a couple of weeks ago to a Washington Post journalist who sneered at one of my columns that his reason for sneering was Trump's very bad approval rating. And I reminded him that his entire coverage of the 2016 election had assumed that Trump would lose to Hillary Clinton because of his very bad approval rating. So it's very striking to me that people who are paid to study and comment on US politics appear to have learned nothing at all from their catastrophically bad performance in 2016. I was one of a handful of columnists who recognized by the October phase of that election that Trump had a chance, and a good chance, of winning. Hardly anybody who's a professional politics pundit or professor of political science saw that coming, and they're making the same mistake now. Let me suggest to you that rather than opinion polls, we should look at revealed preference. The thing about opinion polls is that people lie. You may have noticed in your everyday life that people lie. They lie a lot, and they especially lie when there is a social stigma attached to the answer that they would give in a different setting. In this atmosphere, the atmosphere in America today, where people are denounced, cancelled in the woke parlance, for failing to endorse Black Lives Matter with sufficient enthusiasm, in an atmosphere where corporate leaders are vying with one another to take a knee and abase themselves before the progressive revolutionaries, it is actually not wise to say that you intend to vote Republican on November the 3rd. And so a lot of people don't. Revealed preference is a better guide. Let me give you 2 examples. Since the beginning of this year, there has been a surge in purchases of firearms, especially handguns. The most recent data, which just were published yesterday, show a record purchases in the month of June of firearms, background checks at record levels. Now, one really clear predictor of Republican voting preference in 2016 was ownership of a firearm. Households that owned a firearm overwhelmingly voted Republican. Households without a firearm overwhelmingly voted Democrat. So here's one sign that the polls may be misleading us, unless you think all these guns are being bought by people who already owned guns. And by the way, I'm in the statistics, just saying. And I certainly didn't own a firearm before. Second example of revealed preference. I mentioned already Tucker Carlson, the Fox News anchor. Tucker's commentary on Black Lives Matter has been astonishingly brave. He has not hesitated to question the good faith of the protests. He's not hesitated to suggest that the political agenda of Black Lives Matter is a sinister one with strong Marxist undercurrents. He's been punished by advertisers because corporate America wants to virtue signal at every opportunity. So a number of companies pulled their ads from the Tucker Carlson show. But his ratings have reached a record high in the past month, breaking cable TV rating records. So those are just two illustrations of why this isn't over and why the silent majority strategy, which, as you rightly say, dates back to Nixon 1968, may yet prove to be a winning strategy. I fully expect the establishment commentators to be as wrong in 2020 as they were in 2016. I'm not sure that Trump will win. I think it will be a tie. I fear very much that the result will be a repeat of the 2000 result. The difference being that it will cause a major crisis that will last weeks, if not months. At least 5 states, probably more, will have their results challenged. I predict there will be no clear winner on the morning of November the 4th. And that will be, I think, another Dragon King moment, because we will be plunged into a deep domestic political crisis, just as Cold War II escalates. And I would also predict that Russia and China will take full advantage of a period of political paralysis in the United States. So that's what my crystal ball is telling me. And all people on this call are welcome to jeer and laugh if Joe Biden wins by a landslide on November the 3rd.
Good. One last question, Niall. On the other side of the Atlantic, your own country is going through, of course, a very tough period. Looking beyond this immediate period and thinking about the medium and long-term consequences of Brexit, an event that you very much opposed, that you criticized very publicly, what do you see happening? Where do you see your country of origin going in the post-Brexit world?
I was against Brexit, not because I love the European Union. I was a Eurosceptic on the key issue of the 1990s, which was monetary union, but because I thought the divorce would be extraordinarily difficult and messy. And I didn't believe that the benefits of Brexit would exceed the costs. My wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, disagreed with me. Most of my friends disagreed with me. I found myself on the wrong side, as it were, of a number of my friends who were pro-Brexit. I think that I've been vindicated in that this divorce has been even more costly and protracted than my own divorce was some years ago. And I think they've been vindicated in that I think it, in the end, was the right thing for both Britain and the European Union. I think, for example, that the European Union's recent steps in the direction of fiscal integration necessitated by the crisis would have been impossible if Britain had still been sitting at the negotiating table. I think the United States of Europe, the integration of the EU into something like a federal system can't happen or couldn't happen with Britain as a member. So from a European perspective, I think Brexit is was in fact a necessary step. I also think that Britain, precisely for that reason, has to make a success of its restored independence. And I think what we've seen in the past 6 months is that Britain's problems primarily lie in Britain's institutions and not in EU membership. And the failure of Britain in the face of COVID-19 has laid bare all that is wrong with the British state, much of which, by the way, has been pointed out before by Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's chief advisor, now the second most hated man in Britain after the other Niall Ferguson. But this has been Dom Cummings' theme for many years, that the British state is broken. And Brexit was never going to cure that. I think it's going to be very difficult for Britain. I think the prospects are bleak because, unlike in the United States, where people are itching to get back to work in most parts of the country, the British have discovered that if you are blessed with nice spring weather and a regular check from Rishi Sunak, life is really quite good and one doesn't miss work at all. now that the prospects of county cricket have brightened and the Premier League has restarted, I think Britain is going to find itself back in the 1970s. It's going to be back in the 1970s in that people don't really want to work and quite like a cup of tea and a day off. It's going to be back in the 1970s in the sense that there will be stagflation, because I think the UK economy will be particularly badly affected by the things we've discussed. And finally, it'll be back to the 1970s because that's, after all, when Britain joined the European Economic Community as it was then known. And the reason we joined was that we weren't actually doing terribly well on our own. That was the whole rationale of membership. So I think Britain is heading back to 1972, and I'm old enough to remember 1972. So brace yourselves if you happen to find yourselves in London. It's going to get a lot grungier than it has been over recent decades in the coming years.
Well, I guess the consolation, Neil, will be that if you go back to the 70s, then there will be another Margaret Thatcher a few years down the road.
I live in hope that another Margaret Thatcher will materialize, but right now, in the short run, we've discovered two things. Firstly, that Boris Johnson was a parody of Winston Churchill, not a replica. And secondly, that the Labour Party, having got rid of the odious Marxist Jeremy Corbyn, now has a credible leader again in Keir Starmer, who has at least some Tony Blair-like qualities. So I guess it's a reasonably easy thing to see in the crystal ball that when there's next a general election in Britain, Labour will win and Starmer will be Prime Minister. And then it really will be the 1970s. The consolation for me, actually, Alvaro, is not political, it's cultural. The 1970s were a terrible time in Britain economically, but British comedy was at its absolute finest. And my 8-year-old has proposed that there is, in fact, a vaccine against WOKID-19, the contagion of the mind, and it consists of watching Monty Python and Fawlty Towers. So maybe Britain will be able to recover some of its comic greatness in this return to the 1970s. That's what I'm hoping for.
Let's hope so. Well, all good things come to an end. So I'm sorry to say this is the end of the road. It's been a real privilege picking your brain, Neil. We're really, really grateful to you for this wonderful opportunity. And I hope you come back to us. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. And I've been trying to keep one eye on the chat column, though it's always a little hard to do. And I've very much appreciated the engagement of the people on this call. I think your chat rate is much higher than the average chat rate on a Zoom call. And that's really enjoyable to see. I've also been delighted to see people from all over the Spanish-speaking world on the call. It's a world that I'm deeply fascinated by, that I'm more and more engaged in, not least because of my friends and interests in Argentina. And so thanks to everybody for joining. And I hope this will be the first of many conversations, virtual and perhaps ultimately in the same physical space.
Wonderful.
Muchas gracias.